Now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Bride of Dracula. Goddess Next Door and John Haynes team up to take on the Dark Vampire Lord in this action-packed Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Bride of Dracula in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers today. Now that Marvel Studios' Black Panther has made over $400 million at the box office, I have to ask, where do we go from here? Do we continue to push for the promotion of more African American fantasy and science fiction? Or is this going to be it, where African Americans spend all their money with the Disney Corporation on a white man's version of an African American hero? Or do African Americans make efforts to go out and explore African American fantasy and science fiction? Because we really need to start setting a course for where we want to go when it comes down to African American fantasy and science fiction in the black community. Because with this Black Panther, many are saying that it's some sort of milestone, but in order for it to be a milestone, we have to have a plan to move forward. And this is the big problem with the black community. Most of the black community came out in force to go spend money to see Black Panther, but we don't hear any sort of plans on how to get African American fantasy and science fiction in the hands of African Americans and African American children. Now, I've been making videos about African American fantasy and science fiction for the last 3 to 4 years, and I've been publishing and writing African American fantasy for the last decade or so. And I've been making these efforts in spite of having the road literally against me for years, because when it comes down to African American fantasy and science fiction, there was literally next to no interest in it for years. And I was making these videos and promoting them, and not that many people wanted to talk about African American fantasy and science fiction in the mainstream. But with the popularity of this Black Panther movie, we now have a platform to promote this genre and promote the work and literature in this genre and the comic books created by black creators. And this was one of the issues I have had regarding this whole Black Panther movie and the frenzy that's been around it, is that no one has made any real serious efforts to go out and promote these black-owned comic books by black comic creators, black fantasy novels by fantasy writers like myself and many others, or black science fiction by black science fiction writers, science fiction and fantasy created from an African American perspective and presenting the African American experience of science fiction, comic books, and fantasy. No one in the mainstream media has talked about it, and even worse, no one in the black media has talked about our media. Everybody's gone crazy over Black Panther, but no one has talked about these black comic creators, these black fantasy writers, or these black science fiction writers. But if we don't talk about them and we don't use the platform to promote their work, what happens is the whole platform starts to crumble and fall completely apart. Because, again, where do we go from here? Black Panther was supposed to be the milestone that opened the door, but when it comes down to African Americans, I just see them spending their money with the Disney Corporation and then walking away. And this one of the reasons why I believe they're walking away is because this was really all about many getting white attention and white approval and seeing white people make a film featuring black people, but not about promoting the black image from a different perspective. Because when I was part of this comic book hobby ever since I was 4 years old, when I became a teenager, I was all about promoting the image of black people in fantasy and science fiction, and seeing more images of African Americans in fantasy and science fiction. So this was something that meant something to me, and here we have this opportunity to move the genre forward and get more exposure for the genre, but I don't see many African Americans with a plan to reach larger audiences and really get some mainstream press for many of these black comic creators, many of these black sci-fi writers, and many of these black fantasy writers who have been working hard for years on stories in the genre. No one's really trying to push them. All it is all about Marvel and Disney, and that's not really good for the black community because if black people aren't the ones producing their own fantasy and science fiction, then African Americans are not going to get fantasy that presents them in the most balanced and humanized light or makes efforts to put black first. Because oftentimes, when it comes down to fantasy and science fiction from whites and non blacks, they do not put us in the forefront or they give us their vision of what they believe black people should be. I believe that the best image of African Americans comes from African Americans, and the best stories about African Americans come from African Americans because we best know how to tell stories about our experience, and we are the best ones who know about our own culture and incorporate it in a way that shows how we see the future, how we see the past, and how we see the world. Unfortunately, when it comes down to most African Americans, they don't really seem like they're too enthusiastic about African American fantasy and science fiction and comic books from black comic creators. However, as I see it, they're going to be the future of this genre because if we take a look at most of the media that presents superheroes and comic books in their adaptations, they have literally adapted almost every African American character in a television show or a movie right now. So Marvel and DC are out of their properties because they've adapted all their characters. But there is a whole catalog of characters out there that are waiting to be adapted that are owned by African American creators out here of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy. And all it takes is for the black community to make the effort to support those creators to make those characters just as popular as they made Black Panther. If we took some of that $400 million that we took to spend to support Black Panther and then poured it into black comic creators, black sci-fi creators, and black fantasy creators, we could create a character that is just as popular as the Black Panther or even more popular than the Black Panther and could be so popular that it could lead to them getting licensing, merchandising, and even their own television show or film. Unfortunately, most African Americans believe that the white man's ice is colder and won't pour their support into that type of character, pour that type of enthusiasm into that black character because when it comes down to many black people, they just see themselves as second best instead of putting themselves first. If we put black first, we could take one of these characters owned by a black creator like myself or many of these other black comic and fantasy creators and elevate those characters to a higher level, and that character could become the next Harry Potter or the next Hunger Games or the next Black Panther, and we could have a platform for our own character, and we could create our own platform for reaching a larger audience of people and reaching audiences around the world because this is something we could do for ourselves. Unfortunately, most black people, they thought Black Panther was the end-all be-all, when really this is something we should have been doing before this film was announced. But again, we're not really looking at the big picture regarding things as related to this genre. All we're sitting there is thinking is waiting for the next Black Panther movie when we should be focusing on helping the next black creator get to the next level so they can create media for us and create jobs for us and create a platform for us that allows people to see us outside of the old stereotypes created by mainstream media, and a platform where we can create images of ourselves that show us in the past, show us in the future, and show us in other worlds, and show us how we see those other worlds from our own perspective and from our own experience. When I look at this opportunity that is in front of black people and I see how they're getting ready to miss it, I see an opportunity that really desperately needs to be capitalized on, because if more people start to learn more about black-owned African American comics, black-owned African American fantasy, and black-owned science fiction, what that's going to do is change the way black people are seen throughout the world. Now, if you want to try some of my African American fantasy, like the ISIS series, the East series, The Temptation of John Haynes, The Man Who Rules the World, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box, and you can purchase those books in paperback or ebook. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.